Okay, I literally just finished reading Pontypool Changes Everything by Tony Burgess. I read it all in one day, and I know that's probably going to affect my analysis of the info, but I'll try and get my thoughts out here. This is a very complicated book for a lot of reasons. To start, for those who aren't familiar with the plot of Pontypool, or that haven't seen my Pontypool movie review, the plot is loosely, and I especially mean loosely in the book here, a zombie outbreak occurs, and the virus is spread through language, and there's an extremely complicated set of rules behind this, an extremely complicated set of reasonings that follow onwards with it, that you're really going to need to read the book or watch the movie to understand. Suffice to say that that's the backdrop of the story, and much of the plot plays out in the wake of this outbreak, rather than the initial outpouring of it. Scattered thoughts on it. I want to say that this book, the plot is really just that. It is extremely scattered. The first 115, 120 pages focus on three main characters, and it's fairly readable. The only problem is you don't realize until about 40 pages in that the character has an extremely altered perception of things, which would have been really helpful 40 pages after that, and afterwards, after those 40 pages, it becomes even more confusing because one of the other main characters also has altered perceptions of reality, so you're not quite sure if it's the virus taking in, if it's mentality, and I would call this smart, but at times it just gets downright opaque, and you can't understand a lot of it. I had to reread multiple passages, and now I am not a lightweight reader. I may not be an extremely literary person, but I'm an English specialist at the University of Toronto. I'm currently at the end of my second year, and I'm doing fine in it, so it's not like I'm not like a slouch here. But I just want to say it's a very difficult book to read. It's eminently readable because you're intrigued by it. You really want to know what's happening and what's going to happen. And I thought that this book, like I said before, was very interesting because most of it was focusing on the effects after the outbreak and the cleanup and the fallout of it, which was really fascinating, which you don't really see that in a lot of zombie apocalypse things, because either, well, the world just outright ends and zombies take over, or they just kind of end on a scene where it's like, oh, they've escaped those zombies and now they got to these ones. I would stress to say this book isn't necessarily about the zombies per se. The zombies, much like the movie, act as the thematic backdrop to the book, where they are definitely the ones that set events in motion. They're the novum of the book, but the thing is, a lot of the story is not the typical action that you would suspect, and yet not in the same way as the movie, where most of the action is focused on dialogue. This is a lot focused on evocative, illustrative language, which helps because, like I said, in the first 120 pages, especially the characters, not only they have an altered perception of reality and experience things perhaps more poetically than the normal person would perceive, but the author has a tendency to both digress and be poetically illustrative of events rather than straightforward descriptions, adding to the difficulty of the reading. Anyway, I don't want to spend so much time commenting on how this book is difficult to read, because like I said, it is very readable in that you want to know what's going on, so it's not a slow read, but it's certainly one that requires all of your attention to fully grasp. And I'm not going to lie and pretend like I understand all of it, but I will try and do my best. Continuing on, I just wanted to say I thought that there was a lot of interesting themes that were in the movie, and yes, I'm going to be relating back to the movie a lot, that were in the novel, and I thought processed almost better in the novel in some cases and worse in some cases. But mainly there was a lot of commentary on relationships, marriage, and love, as well as a lot of reoccurring themes of the destruction of youth, and of disease as more of a wake-up call to the real horrors of society. And it was also a lot of really confusion regarding the origins of the virus. There's dimensional studies, there's the language-based thing that I'm only going to presume it totally is because of the movie, and because it was adapted by Tony Burgess, and Bruce McDonald was... Bruce McDonald was just directing it, but there was a lot of religious undertones to this, where the virus is possibly God-born, not only mentioned that one character literally has his higher power act as an existing invisible character which is even more confusing than it sounds. But overall, I will say, the themes were incredibly interesting as you're reading them, though they did interfere at times with perhaps one's comprehension of the actual plot at hand. I thought Tony Burgess could have done a better job in explaining fully what was literally and physically happening, rather than trying to mentally compose a picture of that person's feelings. And I gotta say, I liked this book overall, but it comes with a large caveat that if you did not like the movie, and I would advise one to watch the movie first, you will hate the book. If only because the book requires such an amount of concentration and attention that if you're not thoroughly interested in the subject matter, you will not get a lot out of this book. This book is also likely above many people's level. Not to praise myself, I'm saying it's above my level too. But if you like horror, and are particularly a literary person, and if you like very poetic, descriptive, and books that you like to think about and ponder the ideas presented in them, this is a very idea-driven story. This is not a fact-driven story, per se. Of course, it's not zombies, I'm not meaning that, but this is not factually in that the events at hand aren't necessarily the most important things going on at the time. It's what the writer wants to get across to you. And in particular, I just wanted to go into the end a little. I'm not trying not to spoil anything, but I thought that the last 4 or 5 chapters went completely over the top and out of the realm of possibility. And I mean that in not a good way, because I realize that we're reading a language-based zombie novel, don't get me wrong, but this is a higher-minded novel, and I didn't think that it made that transition to this over-the-top high-mindedness very well. It tried to get a little too heady for its own good, and at times just got a little outright absurd, especially involving Jimmy and Julie, the characters later in the novel. And the last chapter didn't really do anything for me. I didn't feel a sense of closure. In fact, I thought the chapter right before it had a better sense of closure, almost as if it should have ended there. And I also have to acknowledge this book is clearly influenced by my favorite quote-unquote writer, Walt Whitman. If you haven't read Walt Whitman, he's an extremely alliterative person who has long-running sentences of ideas and poetic descriptions, and while that thankfully is not so much into play here, you can definitely tell that there's parts of it evident. And the second last chapter is a very Walt Whitman-esque chapter. If you like Walt Whitman, then I gotta say, you're probably gonna love this book. And you know what? You should definitely check it out. Otherwise, be wary. This is a book that requires a lot of attention, a lot of analysis, even as you're reading it. I think I might read this book a second time in the summer to try and wrap my head fully around it. But at the same time, I do think this is a very flawed book. I think it dwells too much on ideas at times. The physical events become so opaque that it just defies any sense of comprehension. Near the end of the 120-page story arc, especially so. And the book can be outright a little too crude at times. And I don't mean that gore-wise. I actually think it's pretty tasteful in that respect, though appropriately gruesome. Realistically gruesome, I mean. I do think that it overwhelms itself with physical details. I'm not going to say a whole lot on it, because I think you know what I mean. If you don't, you really want to know, just message me, I'll tell you. But anyways, I just want to wrap up, because I'm running out of time here, and say that Pontypool Changes Everything by Tony Burgess is a book that is extremely experimental. It's not for everyone. I'm not sure it's my favorite book. In fact, I know it isn't. But it was definitely an interesting read. If you're watching the movie and want to experience the book, thinking to yourself you'll understand the movie more, not so much. You might in little portions, maybe understand the thinking behind it a little better. But overall, it's not going to help your understanding of that. On the other hand, if you want a highly experimental, interesting zombie novel, horror novel, that you haven't read before, this is certainly it. It may be extremely challenging and complex, but it can be worth the read if you're into it.